Fresh Air production.
Hello, my name's Neil Cowling, and as the founder of Fresh Air, I spend most of my time thinking about branded podcasts, why businesses should have them, how they work, and what makes them successful. However, I'm aware that very few other people do. So that's why we created this series, Fresh Ears from Fresh Air Production. In each episode, we deconstruct, dissect, and chat through a branded podcast series with the client, the producer, and anyone else involved to see what we can learn. And more importantly, what you might be able to glean if you're thinking of creating a podcast for your business. We're talking about branded podcasts in a branded podcast, so we'll follow that rabbit hole for half an hour and see where it takes us. We work for all sorts of brands, large and small, but on our client list, they don't come much bigger than Shell with the Energy Podcast.
Will renewables, wind and solar, be enough to meet global energy demands?
When the wind stops blowing, when the sun stops shining, we still need to have power, we still need to have energy. And then we look for a source of energy to complement those fuels.
Or could natural gas be a way to help reduce emissions?
When you look at what has actually helped to put a lid on the rise in global emissions over the last few years, in fact, coal to gas switching has played quite a significant role.
So why would a massive multinational oil and gas company want to talk to people via a podcast? And what would they be trying to achieve with it? How would it feel like anything other than corporate propaganda? Let's find out. So with me is Bryony, MacKenzie, the editor of digital channels at Shell, and Annie Day, our senior producer here at Fresh Air. Hello.
Hi. Hi.
Bryony, let's start by summarising a little bit what the Energy Podcast is, what it does, how it sounds. How would you characterise it as a series?
Hi, Neil. Well, obviously it sounds great, I want to say first and foremost. As a series, so the idea is that we talk about all things energy related. At the moment, we try and do roughly one a month, and we, on each episode, focus on different aspects of the interesting parts of energy. So at the moment, obviously in the news a lot, there's that push to lower emissions. So we might take an episode and say, well, let's look at how you lower emissions in the road transport sector, for example. So we talk a lot about EVs, and we get on a panel of guests who are experts from all over, global experts. And we try and do a case study and talk to some real people. And then also what we try and do is have someone on who's critical, who's the other side of the fence, who thinks that there are better ways to do things. And then we wrap them all up into a 20-minute podcast.
You're a journalist by background. You also present this podcast, but say you're editor of digital channels for Shell. So why does Shell have a podcast? What's the point?
I think it's a really good question. And I think a lot of people are quite surprised when they realise that an energy company has a podcast. I mean, they're great for Shell, I think, for three reasons. Podcasts are global. And as you said, Shell is a multinational. So it's really important for us to have that global platform. Secondly, it's really important for us to have that robust conversation around the big topics. And we found that podcasts really enable us to do that. Have a real deep dive, hear different arguments, and have a debate, which is sort of particularly important in the industry that we're in. And I think lastly, as a form of communication, you read any analysis and podcasts are becoming more popular. So as a means of communicating with an audience, they're really, really valuable for reaching people, because we know that more and more people, especially in the areas that we have a lot of clients in, a lot of customers, a lot of interested people, they're listening there. So UK, Netherlands, the US, that's where our market is. So they're a really, really important tool for us.
And I remember when we first started talking about it, we set out Shell's phrase for a target audience is energy engaged millennials, but essentially those who are interested in the energy system, those who take an interest in the move towards lower emissions, etc. Fair to say Shell is probably not an uncontroversial organisation. What's the comms challenge that you deal with? What are you trying to change people's minds of, or what are you trying to have as an objective behind the podcast? So
my particular goal, my personal goal, is to engage with people who have no interest in us as a company. And that is a challenge But yeah, I think a podcast really helps with that. And I think the energy podcast from the outset, and you'll know this, Neil, because you were there before me at the beginning. From the outset, we aim to ask difficult questions. An example being the episode titled, "Why Doesn't Shell Just Stop Producing Oil and Gas?" So what we hope to achieve is for people to see the companies capable of being challenged, asking really difficult questions of ourselves, questioning our role and what we're doing. And as I said before, it's a really important time for us as a company to be transparent and hold ourselves accountable, particularly with the focus on climate change at the moment.
So Annie, let's bring you in. So as producer of the series, and your background is journalism as well. So how do you go about setting up an episode for Shell? What are your priorities when you're thinking about how to communicate Shell's messages through a podcast?
I would probably say from the outset that it's a collaboration. So they don't just kind of give me a topic and say, work with it. And I do think that that's actually developed quite a lot since we started doing the podcast. So I think probably as Shell have learned to trust us and worked out more about what we can do, they've gone with us a lot more. And I probably had to do a bit more legwork on sort of working out which guests might fit in at the very beginning. Whereas now what would probably happen is that they'll have a topic in mind and they'll have an idea of the sort of people that they want to talk to. And then really it's for me to sort of go away, speak to those guests and work on a script with Bryony and try and work out how we can tell the story along the way. So it is very much talking to Bryony throughout, making sure that the points that they want to get across are included in what I'm writing, but also make sure that what we're writing isn't really dry. And I think that's where the creativity has to come in as well. And I think probably it's fair to say that none of the podcasts are the same as each other. So some of the podcasts are just straight debates. So it's literally been, for Blockchain, for example, it was just an introduction, a debate with a number of guests, and then that was it. Others have been much more detailed. They've got lots of different elements to them. We've been out and spoken to people. We've had people in the studio. So it's totally topic dependent, but it's all the way through. It's me constantly communicating with Bryony, finding out what they want to do and having a chat about what could be possible and working in some creativity into what they want, basically.
So Annie, we moved between topic areas, we move between formats. Some of them are straight interviews, some of them are much more complicated, as we've talked about. We do have consistent threads throughout because it's supposed to feel like a series. It's supposed to feel like it's got some glue between it. What are those elements? How does it feel like it all sticks together?
So one of the most consistent things is the presenter. So Bryony at the moment is presenting, and the format is flexible. Obviously all the topics are different. I don't think we've returned to any topics yet, but there is consistency throughout. So I've made a point of having the same music that opens the podcast every episode, and that's just a little trigger to people in their minds. And if you hear that music, you think, oh, this is Shell. So we've got the same music at the beginning, and we've got the same music at the end, and I've got a little selection of what we call music beds that I can just drop in and out throughout the rest of the episode. And loosely, every introduction is slightly different, but it's got a sort of fixed format in that Bryony is setting up the episode and she's asking a question at the beginning, and we always have a conclusion at the end as well, because there's no point in asking a question if you don't answer it. But then the bit in the sandwich is the bit that changes. That's where the rest of the creativity comes in.
And Bryony, how do you decide what you want to do and what creative approach to take in each episode? Because there must be so many topics that you could cover as an organisation in any given month. How do you decide that?
I think I'm going to fill Annie with dread now and say we want to do another blockchain podcast.
Oh, nice. Oh, we all look forward to that.
I went to a conference, it's fine.
How do we decide on what we do? We have sort of several things we have to take into account. So we have to take into account the broader topics that the company wants to talk about. And that's the sort of direction of travel for the business. For me personally, and as you said, Annie and I are from similar backgrounds, that we both journalists and we've both worked at the BBC for a long time. To me, I want to talk about what's in the news. I want to talk about what everyone else is talking about, because that way I think that we're going to get more engagement and more people are going to listen. And it shows that we're not following or sometimes leading in the conversation, which is really important. I mean, what Annie does brilliantly is bring it to life, because we have got quite a few journalists at Shell, and a colleague of mine, Claire, who we both work on the podcast together. Claire's, from a newspaper background, I'm from a TV news background. But what has been brilliant is that obviously Annie is an audio specialist. It is a collaboration, but she will very much say that doesn't work, or I think you should do this, or let's come up with creative ideas just to make it sound better, which for us is brilliant. So our relationship's very much developed into, it's blossomed, hasn't it, Annie?
And you've got three tensions there, haven't you? You've got a creativity, which is, creating something that people want to hear. You've got a journalistic rigour, which is a sort of independence, and we try and be a critical friend. And, as you say, Annie will push back and think about it from a journalistic point of view. But you've also got corporate comms. You've got stuff that you want to say and you need to be in there. So how do you balance those three things? Is that just an instinct, or do you have to have lots of internal conversations around that?
I think what happened in the beginning, and I can't take credit for this because I wasn't there when the podcast actually started, what was really well done was really nailing down what the podcast was and what it wasn't. And that has been really stuck to through thick and thin. And, because in a large organization, not just Shell, but any big organization, there is a much bigger thrust towards the business side as there would naturally be. And if you have a really strong, I think ours is called a podcast charter, but if you have a really good outline and say, we know that you want to talk about electric vehicles, so the rest of the world calls them electric vehicles or EVs. And you'll find in big organizations, they have their own language. They might talk about EVs and call it mobility. So you really have to kind of say, this is the audience we're trying to reach. They are people who are energy engaged, but essentially we have to be plain spoken. We have to make it engaging and creative and informative. And it's not just another marketing or PR tool. This is different. And I think as soon as people get on board with that from the beginning and they can see the value, then that's fine. I think it would be more difficult to do that further down the line. You have to kind of nail that down initially so that people trust you and say, okay, well, that sounds good. You go off and make it. And then obviously we come to you.
I remember some of the first meetings that we had about it, and the person working with us at the time just said to me, constantly ask, is this interesting? Or even stronger, is this boring? Do you care? And to have a brand say that to you, it really took me aback, because that doesn't always happen. And he was very clear, this is not a puff piece for Shell. So if at any point you're listening to something and you think this is just one big advert, or you're listening and you've just totally zoned out, tell us, and you'd be bold enough to tell us. And they've absolutely stuck to that throughout.
Yeah, you have to try and self-police when it comes to acronyms and language and that sort of thing, don't you? And you, Annie, have to insert lines in the script that say, what do you mean by that? Or a prompt in a recording to say, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, exactly that. And in the past, we have had conversations with team members who are totally absorbed in these subjects every day. It's all they work on. And so it's my job to take a step back and say, actually, you're delving far too deep into that. Back up. Take yourself back to the level before you started working in this industry, because we want detail, we want context. But you don't want to blind the audience with science. And so we have had a few conversations where we've said, actually, that is too much. You need to kind of step out of the Shell bubble and put yourself into the real world, as it were.
We've had quite a few conversations around episode titles, which is a real kind of struggle. And I think actually the ones that you always suggest always end up being the ones that go on, because you know what people are going to click on, and it's a sort of turn of phrase, and there's a real skill in that I think is really valuable. And I think, I guess with companies as well, any company, they would tend to want to err on the side of caution, whereas, being a bit provocative is actually quite good. And I think people at Shell, the businesses at Shell, have really realised there's a value in that as well.
The other thing that we've always tried to do from the start, I think, is add colour, what we would call colour to, which sounds crazy in an audio product, but we're doing an episode about tree planting. Let's go and record it in a forest. We're doing an episode about hydrogen. Let's go to a filling station where they've got hydrogen and we can demonstrate it, and the presenter can drink the water from the exhaust pipe. That sort of stuff where it's getting out of a studio. I've always felt that that's really something that Shell's input and you've always allowed us to have that creative freedom. And it may not sound like a radical idea, but it just gives it something more than you would get from just getting a bunch of people in a studio together, doesn't it? Annie, on the practical side of the guest, so you've got a brief from Shell, you need to talk about this topic. Probably this is the angle we want to cover. How much on a practical level do you get told what guests to include, or are you given an open brief, go and find somebody to talk about hydrogen? How does that work?
I would say that's changed slightly over time. And again, I think this is partly because Shell know more about what they want. And also, I think that the way generally that the episodes work is that we're working on a podcast for a team in Shell. And I think that as we've gone along, the teams have heard the podcasts and heard what's possible. And so they've very clearly gone away and thought about what could be suitable. And let's be honest, they've got amazing contact books and they know who the experts are on these subjects because they live and breathe it and I don't. So to begin with, probably it's fair to say that I was given topics like carbon capture. I was maybe giving the starting point, but I was doing quite a lot of the research, and blockchain is a good example of this. Neil, you and I had a lovely day in a conference hall in London, learning more than I ever thought.
Blockchain Live, recommend it to anyone.
Exactly. I never thought I needed to know so much about blockchain, but actually it was invaluable because I came away with a list of guests that I could then approach and suggest to Shell. And they were the people that we ended up on the podcast. Whereas now I think, as I said, as the teams have become more aware of how we work and what we can do, they're generally coming to us with the guest suggestions. So they're not nailed down. And if these people aren't available or they don't want to do it, or I find somebody better, then they'll absolutely go with it. But from my point of view, it would be silly to look a gift horse in the mouth if they've got connections. And by connections, I don't mean internal Shell people. And I do think that that's a really important thing to say, that we're not booking guests that are either only going to agree with Shell or are going to agree with each other, because if you're doing a panel discussion and all the guests agree, what's the point of that? And if you've only got guests who say Shell are brilliant, again, what's the point of that? So I think now it's much more Shell offering the suggestions. I go away, do the brief, and then come back. As I said, it is a collaboration. Come back to Bryony and say, these are the areas that they can discuss. Do you think that this works? Is this the direction that this could go in?
I mean, you say, what's the point of that? And it seems kind of obvious, but I think I've always been genuinely really surprised and impressed by Shell's bravery and ability to invite people with a contrary point of view onto your own podcast. And I know this sounds like I'm just sort of blowing smoke, but the point is, we did that episode in the forest, and there was a contributor from Friends of the Earth who came on and was involved in a conversation on Shell's own podcast to be critical of Shell's own policy. I think that's an extraordinary thing for a multinational like Shell to do. Is that normal, Bryony? Is that something you would do in any other medium, or is that something that's different for podcasts?
I think that the podcast has probably led the way in that. I do think that from starting out and saying we are going to have people who criticise, who are critical of what we're doing. And we're fine with that because it's a discussion and it's not black and white. And there are so many ways to slice a cake that, we're not going to be right all the time. Does Shell do it in other mediums? At the very highest level, we all have the sort of the CEO and other sort of senior leaders having sort of robust debate and being challenged. But I think the podcast is unique in that respect. And I don't know if there are any other energy companies that are really doing that. And to us as an organisation, I think it's really important because of transparency. And we need to really be open and honest about what we're doing, what we're not doing, and what we need to do more of. It does really align with that. So I think we're just a really difficult and crucial point in that kind of transition period where we need to make change. So this really does back that up, that, okay, who are we going to have on to tell us how we need to make change or why they think we need to make change? And that's fine. That's good.
And at risk of answering my own question, it's to do with the depth of conversation you can have in podcasting, isn't it? Because 20, 25, 30 minutes, you can have nuanced debate about something that you can't in a short blog or in a 3-minute YouTube video.
What I've realised is that you could have 3 people on who have completely opposing views and might come at something from completely different angles, but it's a really interesting listen, and it's not the tone of it, or the tone of our podcast, is not particularly, combative, I wouldn't say. People are really respectful and just put their point across.
Yeah, it's definitely not combative. But when I'm booking any of the guests and we are doing a discussion, I always say to them, don't be too nice, don't be too friendly. If somebody says of you that you disagree with, feel free to be critical. That's what you're on here for. So we don't want them yelling at each other. But we have had some really nice discussions, and you can always tell when you get a great point like that, because it makes a brilliant teaser clip for the beginning of the podcast. So you can just take that out and if you've got three little opposing views, that's fantastic. And, that is a gem from a debate. But, what we don't want is them all shouting at each other, but just a little bit of tension, I think, works really well. And you want to give different points to the audience. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it.
The other challenge you've got in terms of booking guests and trying to get balance is that we want it to be a global podcast. And you mentioned that earlier. Shell is a Anglo-Dutch company. It's produced in the UK. The podcast is produced in the UK by us. It's got an English presenter. How do you go about making it feel like it's global?
I think that's totally down to the guests. And this series, we've had guests in America. We've had somebody from China. We've had voices from Kenya, from India. And it is just getting those different voices and those different textures in each podcast. So bizarrely, actually, lockdown has probably helped that, because you're not asking people to come to a studio in London. As long as you work around the time difference, you can get somebody on a conference call. It's also using much more subtle and really simple techniques. So if you're talking about a location, just say London. You don't need to be really specific and say that you're in the middle of Hammersmith, because if you're listening to it in Australia, they have no idea probably where Hammersmith is. They've probably got a pretty good idea where London is. So I often see my job to go through the script and just make sure that we're not being too tiny. We're not being too UK centric. Think bigger. Who can we go to that's not just a London voice? Can we go to Australia, for example? And certainly with carbon capture, we had Japan, Australia and London all on the same podcast. And I think only one of them was in the studio at the time.
And Bryony, one of the key examples of this is really at the start of lockdown. I remember having a conversation literally as lockdown happened, where rather than saying, OK, let's stop doing all this for a bit, it all sounds too difficult, you essentially told us to make the most complicated programme of the whole series at that point. Tell us a bit about the China episode.
I know you like a challenge, Neil.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, of course.
The China episode. I mean, when we said about China, what were your first thoughts? Because I'd be interested to know, because it was quite a shot in the dark. I think it was like my first episode. And
so we were in a period where lots of people that we work with were thinking we might need to put things on hold for a bit. And also, we know far more now, 6 months later, than we did at that point, about how easy it would be to record remotely, because at the time we had been booking people into studios all the time. So we were just sort of working this out. Obviously, doing a podcast from China, as they've just sparked the biggest pandemic in 100 years, was an interesting dimension. But also having different languages on is always, you were very clear from the start that you've got lots of experts in China, but they were going to be speaking Mandarin rather than English. So that makes it difficult as well. So not that it's impossible, but it certainly adds layers. And I think we've always seen this program as more of a documentary format than a discussion format, as I said earlier about the creativity. So yeah, we're up for the challenge, but I think we learned quite a lot quite quickly in that, didn't we, Yanni, in putting that programme together?
Yeah, it was definitely the most complicated podcast I think I've done. So we had the boss of Shell China. Immediately you've got time differences that you're having to deal with, and also he's quite a busy man. Lockdown or no lockdown, he's quite busy, so trying to get him was a real coup. That was brilliant. He did speak English, but what we really, really wanted to do was reflect some of the people who work for Shell who were doing amazing things really through the pandemic. So one of the people moved out of their house because they were working, they didn't want to be near their children. station. So they moved out temporarily, and somebody else that we spoke to was walking for miles and miles and miles just to get to the petrol station to keep supplies going, basically. They both spoke Mandarin, and so the complexities of trying to interview them were huge. But in the end, what we decided to do was have somebody from Shell China conduct the interview using mobile phones, exactly as we've done with lots of other interviews. They then sent that Mandarin audio back to me. I then had to put it through a transcription service. But then I contacted a Mandarin speaking producer who was fantastic. And then he was able to edit the audio down. And the way it works with me and Bryony is that I give her the raw audio, the transcript. She decides what she wants to keep. And then you're doing that process backwards and forwards. And basically the Mandarin speaking producer is that middle guy. And he was able to edit it all for me, do the voiceover, give it back to me. And at the end, it meant that we had a really lovely mini documentary where they talked about the challenges in China that the energy sector had faced and how they'd come out of it. And it sounded really authentic. We could have just got him to explain their stories, but it was so much nicer to have the authentic voices and to hear them telling their own stories in their own words.
After the epidemic happened, the majority of my colleagues in the city were quarantined at home. Only 3 colleagues who lived near the retail station could report to work. One of them caught a cold and was feeling unwell, and the other 2 were exhausted. I was able to get a temporary pass to go to work.
After the outbreak, what else changed at the retail sites? How did customers react?
They don't talk much. The freight drivers delivering goods especially. They are all fully equipped with masks, visors, gloves.
There was an extra layer of complexity to that I think was a huge challenge. I'm always surprised as well about how when any language crops up, last week it was Swahili, and Annie says, I know someone I've got someone who knows that language. I can sort that out within about 10 seconds as well.
Bryony, how different is it? You come from a TV background, TV news, and Claire is print. When you take the pictures away, how different does it feel? Because we live and breathe audio, but does it make it feel scarier? Does it make it feel perhaps even, add layers of creativity? What are the main differences you found between audio and telly?
For me, the main differences between audio and I think specifically TV news is that obviously, as you say, writing to pictures, you don't have pictures. So what I've found is that I would have a tendency to kind of canter through something and get it done in 2 minutes, and it will be clip script. Whereas what Annie often says is, I'll let that breathe, and we'll add some colour here, and it's a slightly slower, less frenetic pace, because I'm used to sticking to a really, really, really short, tight deadline. So I completely accept that as a listen, that would be so confusing and just wouldn't really work. So I think that's where Annie and I really work well together, because often I'll cut something. You'll say, why don't you put that back in? Because actually what he was saying was really interesting and nice, and you kind of cut him off a bit early. So I tend to cut. My colleague Claire, who works on the podcast as well, she's from papers. So she would write sort of beautiful features. And again, it would look beautiful on paper, but we wouldn't have the expertise that Annie has in audio. So it's like a holy trinity with Annie at the top.
So how do you know if it's worked? How do you know whether this podcast is a good investment from Shell's point of view? How do you know whether it's changing anybody's mind or achieving any of the objectives you've set out for it?
That's a really tricky question, because you could say, well, downloads are going up and subscribers are going up, and therefore it's worked. Job done. Fantastic. I think obviously you need those things. You need that data. But you shouldn't peg everything to data. So a really important thing for us is to say, okay, who do we want to reach? Where are they? So are they, going to the podcast via LinkedIn or Twitter, or, do they come to shell.com, for example, and listen there? And what's their feedback? What's the engagement like? What do they say? When we reach out to someone in the shipping sector, for example, who might say, I've heard your podcast. Someone sent me the podcast, or someone recommended it to me. And it was really good. And yeah, I'd like to come on. So I think that's really important as well. Just the general, and I think we're building on that, the general word of mouth and being seen as a sort of a credible, interesting platform that people want to come on. And as much as I value data, and I know a lot of people live and die by data, I do really think a lot of people have got in contact and said, oh, we'll connect on LinkedIn and say, oh, I'd be really interested in coming on. We can offer this or we can offer that. Experts. For me, that's a really important measure of how well we're doing.
There was definitely an internal momentum that I think kicked off alongside, or probably earlier than, the external momentum, because you've got tens of thousands of employees who are obviously your first route to listeners. And it's not an internal comms podcast, but there's some low-hanging fruit there for getting people to listen when you've got such a large employee base that you can talk to. But also, you mentioned it just now, but there was definitely a feeling that once you're up and running and departments within the organisation can see that it works and can see how other sections are talking about themselves, they want a bit of it. And then they sort of suddenly, one team of people say, I've got a story, this will make a great podcast, would you like to do something on this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In any organisation, people need to feel that they have an element of control, but I think that they trust that you're going to really get their point across, but also create something for them that they're happy to be shared externally. I know a lot of organisations do have internal podcasts. To my mind, I've always thought, and I think having come from the BBC where nothing's internal, really everything is external at all times, that something that's internal to 80,000 people may as well be external, because that's so many people. And really what we want people to do, whether they work for Shell or not, is share. We want them to share the podcast and to say to everyone they know, you should listen to this because it's actually a really interesting listen.
And does that go to the top? Do you get senior exec buy-in to the podcast? Do they even know it exists?
I really hope they do. No, they do. I should be sending a link around now. They do. What we do as an organisation is the senior leaders, so the head of new energies and not the CEO so far, but we get the most senior people we can. They will put that on their LinkedIn. So they'll share the post on their LinkedIn. And these guys have got a huge amount of followers in a sort of key industry players. So we sort of amplify it through really, really big LinkedIn accounts. That really works well for us. Any
other marketing routes that work particularly well for you? How do you reach an external audience?
Predominantly LinkedIn at the moment, because it's just where a lot of our audience is. But obviously we put it on our own website, and obviously through you guys, we have it on Spotify and Apple and all the players as well. And I think we're kind of experimenting really in trying to kind of engage the audience by doing audiograms, which are a kind of work in progress. But I think, we'd like to do more of those in the future, because I think there's a real appetite for audio and a real appetite for podcasts. And it's just, we can see even with, an energy company, which is, we're not Apple, we're not kind of leading the way in this kind of audio world, but definitely people want to hear more of these conversations we're finding.
Annie, any lessons you've learned from working with Shell about how they do it and that other people could learn from?
I think the biggest lesson for me was that the corporate world, and this sounds really obvious, but the corporate world is totally different to working in somewhere like the BBC. Partly because I worked in a very small team, and if I wanted something doing, I usually did it myself, and then probably if I really needed to get a manager to oversee it, they would. But it got made and it went on air the next day. As Bryony's alluded to, everything just takes longer in the corporate world, and that's not a bad thing. But I think it has been an eye-opener, really, as to how many people maybe need to listen to something before it gets out there. And that's fine, because it means that what you get at the end of that couple of weeks is a really, really polished version. Any
tips, tricks you would pass on to others within organisations who are looking to create a podcast of this kind of scale, with this sort of intensity? What have you learned, and what would you say to anyone who's looking to do the same?
Don't take Annie away from us, because you're not allowed to have her. I think there's a couple of things. I think you have to have an overarching theme. So it should be the issue that guides you, and just not a product. To my mind, it's not really a platform to flog stuff or to sell products. It doesn't really work. At least it doesn't really work for what we want to do. If you can talk about issues and engage and have this nice chat and debate, then it's much more interesting than just seeing it as a kind of marketing tool. I think for me, one of the main things was be realistic about the frequency that we could get them out, because they are a lot of work. And I think initially when we had our initial conversations, I probably thought that I was going to be able to produce a lot more than I could. Because if you're having CEOs on and CFOs and people who are really time poor, even recording it remotely, it's quite time consuming. And I would say, and I'm not just saying this, I would say don't just attempt to botch and cotch it and do something yourself. Because the input that you guys have as professionals, both in making it sound beautiful, but the input to say that's not going to work, why don't you do it like this, has really, really added a huge amount of value. And we've seen that in the growth, the amount of people that subscribe and download. And I think if you're an organisation and you think, oh yeah, we'll have a crack at that ourselves, I would think twice about that, because I'm not 100% sure you're going to see the results that you want.
So Shell have made podcasting an ongoing, creative and journalistically rigorous part of their communication system. We never feel like we're making propaganda, and it gets the odd award as well. So everyone's a winner. Thank you to Bryony MacKenzie, editor of digital channels for Shell, and Annie Day, our senior producer and top of the Holy Trinity here at Fresh Air. And if you'd like to find out how Fresh Air Production can help you make a brilliant podcast for your brand or business, we're at freshairproduction.co.uk. I'm Neil Cowling. Thank you very much for listening, and cheers.